They threw me out of the airport like garbage, laughing as I cried on the curb with my broken suitcase. Then a convoy of black limousines pulled up, and the man who stepped out changed everything. What happened next shocked everyone, including me. My name is Christine, and up until 6 months ago, I was just a simple farm girl who had never set foot outside my small town. I inherited a small vegetable farm from my parents when they passed away 3 years ago. It wasn't much, just 20 acres of land where I grew organic tomatoes, carrots, lettuce, and whatever else I could manage with my own 2 hands. My days started before sunrise and ended long after sunset. My hands were permanently stained with soil, my clothes were simple and practical, and my biggest luxury was the old pickup truck my father left me. I lived alone in the farmhouse where I grew up, and honestly, I was okay with that quiet life. I had my vegetables, my few chickens, and the peace that comes with working the land. But I also had dreams. Dreams of expanding my little operation, of maybe supplying fresh produce to bigger markets, of proving that a girl from nowhere could build something meaningful. That's why, when I got a call from a representative of Metropolitan Foods, one of the biggest supermarket chains in the country, asking if I'd be interested in discussing a potential contract, I nearly dropped the phone. They wanted to meet me in person at their headquarters in the city. They were looking for local, organic suppliers, and somehow they'd heard about my farm. I had never been on a plane before, never even been to a big city. But this was the opportunity I'd been praying for, the chance to turn my small farm into something that could actually sustain me long term. So I used every penny I had saved over the past 2 years to buy a plane ticket and book a hotel room for 1 night. The morning of my flight, I stood in front of my bedroom mirror, trying to make myself look presentable for the biggest meeting of my life. I only owned 1 dress that could remotely be considered business appropriate. A simple yellow sundress I'd bought at a discount store 3 years ago for a cousin's wedding. It was clean and modest, but nothing fancy. I braided my long brown hair neatly, put on my grandmother's old pearl earrings, the only jewelry I owned, and grabbed the worn brown suitcase that had belonged to my mother. I looked at myself one more time before leaving. I looked exactly like what I was. A small-town farm girl trying her best to fit into a world she'd never experienced. But I was hopeful. I was determined. I had no idea what was waiting for me. The airport was overwhelming from the moment I walked through those automatic doors. So many people rushing around with purpose, all of them looking important and sophisticated in ways I couldn't even begin to understand. Everyone seemed to know exactly where they were going and what they were doing, while I felt like I was stumbling through a maze. At the check-in counter, the woman behind the desk looked at me like I was bothering her just by existing. She sighed dramatically when I couldn't figure out how to use the electronic kiosk and made me feel stupid for asking basic questions about the boarding process. But I told myself this was just nerves. Surely once I got through security, things would get better. I was wrong. In the security line, I found myself behind a group of business people who kept making comments about the types of people who fly these days. They weren't even trying to be subtle about it. A woman in an expensive red suit kept glancing back at me and whispering to her companions about my old suitcase and simple dress. I heard her say quite clearly, "I don't understand why airlines don't have standards anymore. Some people clearly can't afford to fly and just make it uncomfortable for everyone else." My cheeks burned with embarrassment, but I tried to ignore them. I focused on my reason for being there, the meeting that could change everything for my farm. I reminded myself that I belonged there just as much as anyone else, but it only got worse from there. When I reached my gate, I noticed immediately how different I looked from everyone else. Business suits, designer handbags, expensive watches. I felt like I was wearing a sign that said, "I don't belong here." I found a seat and tried to make myself as small as possible, but even that didn't help. The man sitting next to me, wearing a watch that probably cost more than I made in 6 months, actually got up and moved to a different section when he saw me sit down. The woman across from me wrinkled her nose and made a show of spraying perfume, as if I smelled bad. But there was one person who caught my attention in a different way. Sitting in the first-class waiting area was the most handsome man I'd ever seen. Tall, with dark hair and wearing a perfectly tailored navy suit that probably cost more than my entire year's clothing budget. Every time I glanced over, I caught him looking in my direction, and I assumed he was judging me just like everyone else. I figured even the wealthy, attractive men were finding me amusing in my obvious out-of-placeness. When boarding began, things went from bad to worse. My ticket said 14B, middle seat. The two people I was sitting between took one look at me and started complaining to each other about their bad luck. The man in the aisle seat, who I later learned was some kind of investment banker, actually called the flight attendant over before I'd even sat down. "Excuse me," he said, loud enough for half the plane to hear, "is there any way I can change seats?" I paid full price for this flight, and I don't want to sit next to someone who clearly bought a discount ticket and doesn't understand flight etiquette. The flight attendant, a perfectly made-up woman named Sarah, looked at me like I was the problem. She didn't even check if there were other seats available. She just apologized to him and assured him they'd see what they could do about the situation. I wanted to sink into the floor. I wanted to get off that plane and run back to my farm where nobody looked at me like I was less than human. But I thought about that meeting, about the possibility of finally making my parents' farm into something sustainable, and I forced myself to stay in my seat. The flight took off, and I thought maybe the worst was over. I was wrong again. About an hour into the flight, I tried to eat the peanut butter sandwich I'd packed from home. I couldn't afford airport food, and I'd been too nervous to eat breakfast. The woman in the window seat made a disgusted face and said loudly, "Could you not eat that here? The smell is making me nauseous." Several passengers turned to look, and I quietly put my sandwich away, my stomach growling. When we hit some turbulence, my inexperience with flying showed. I gripped the armrests tightly, probably turning white as a sheet. The businessman beside me rolled his eyes and said to his companion, "First-time flyers should have to sit in a separate section. They make everyone else anxious with their panic." But then something unexpected happened. That handsome man from first class appeared beside my row. He gently tapped the businessman on the shoulder and said, "Excuse me, would you mind if I sit here for a moment? I'd like to give the lady some tips for dealing with turbulence." The businessman looked confused but moved aside. The handsome stranger, I would later learn his name was Alexander, slid into the empty seat and turned to me with the kindest eyes I'd ever seen. "First time flying?" he asked gently, and when I nodded, embarrassed, he smiled. "It's perfectly normal to be nervous. The plane is actually much safer during turbulence than your car is on a normal road. Here, try this breathing technique." He spent the next 20 minutes talking to me in the most soothing voice, explaining how planes work, sharing stories to distract me from my fear, and treating me like I was the most important person on that aircraft. For the first time since entering the airport, I felt human again. When the turbulence stopped, he squeezed my hand gently and said, "You're braver than you know." Anyone who gets on a plane for the first time to chase their dreams has more courage than most people will ever have. Before returning to his seat, he handed me his business card and said, "In case you ever need anything in the city." I looked at the card. Simple, elegant, just a name, Alexander Montgomery, and a phone number. No company name, no title, nothing that would tell me who he was. The rest of the flight passed quietly, but I kept thinking about Alexander's kindness. In a sea of people who had treated me like I was invisible or worse, he had seen me as worthy of respect and compassion. When we landed, I thought my ordeal was over. I gathered my belongings and prepared to start my new adventure in the city. But the universe had other plans. As passengers were disembarking, the same businessman who had complained about sitting next to me made another scene. He told the flight attendant that I had been disruptive during the flight, that my panic during turbulence had made other passengers uncomfortable, and that people like me shouldn't be allowed to fly if we couldn't handle it properly. Other passengers who had witnessed my humiliation throughout the flight began chiming in. The woman in the red suit from security said I had been inappropriate with my homemade food. Someone else complained that I had taken up too much overhead bin space with my old suitcase. Before I knew what was happening, 3 airline security guards were approaching me. The head of airport security, a stern-faced man named Mr. Roberts informed me that multiple passengers had filed complaints about my behavior during the flight. "Ma'am," he said in front of everyone, "we're going to need you to come with us." "But I didn't do anything wrong," I protested, my voice shaking. "I was quiet the entire flight. I didn't bother anyone." "Multiple passengers have stated otherwise," Mr. Roberts replied coldly. "We take passenger comfort and safety very seriously." The airline manager, a sharp-dressed woman who had appeared out of nowhere, stepped forward. "Miss," she said, looking me up and down with obvious disdain, "frankly, you don't meet our standard passenger profile. The complaints against you, combined with your inappropriate attire and behavior, suggest that our airline might not be the right fit for your travel needs." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Inappropriate attire? I'm wearing a dress. I haven't done anything wrong. But they weren't listening. In front of dozens of passengers, including all the people who had mocked and humiliated me throughout the day, they escorted me through the airport like I was a criminal. People stared and whispered. Some of the passengers from my flight followed behind, pointing and laughing as if my public humiliation was the most entertaining thing they'd seen all day. They walked me all the way to the curb outside the airport and left me there with my old suitcase, telling me that I was no longer welcome on their airline and that if I tried to re-enter the airport, I would be arrested for trespassing. I stood there on the sidewalk, shaking and crying, feeling like the most worthless person on earth. My one chance to change my life, to make something of my parents' farm, was slipping away. I had spent every penny I had on this trip, and now I was stranded in a city I didn't know, with no way to get to my meeting and no way to get home. The passengers who had complained about me were walking past, some still laughing, some pointing me out to companions who hadn't been on the flight. "That's her," I heard the businessman say to someone. "The crazy farm girl who had a meltdown on the plane." I sat down on the curb next to my suitcase and put my head in my hands. I had never felt so small, so invisible, so utterly defeated. 28 years old, and this was what my life had come to, being thrown out of an airport like garbage while strangers laughed at my pain. But then I heard the sound of expensive car engines pulling up to the curb. I looked up through my tears to see a convoy of 3 black limousines arriving in perfect formation. The center limousine was the longest and most luxurious vehicle I had ever seen in person. The back door of the center limousine opened, and out stepped Alexander Montgomery, the kind man who had comforted me during the flight. But he looked different now. There were men in black suits flanking him, people with earpieces and serious expressions who were clearly bodyguards. Other well-dressed people emerged from the other vehicles, all of them moving with the kind of precision that spoke of wealth and power. Alexander looked around until his eyes found me sitting on the curb, and his expression shifted to one of fury. He strode directly toward me, and every person within 50 feet stopped what they were doing to watch. "Christine," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the pickup area, "I've been looking everywhere for you." I was confused, still crying, still trying to understand what was happening. "Alexander? They threw me out. They said I don't belong." He helped me to my feet with a gentleness that contrasted sharply with the cold efficiency of his security team. But when he turned to address the crowd of onlookers, including the passengers and airline staff who had humiliated me, his voice carried an authority that made everyone freeze. "How dare you treat this lady like this?" he said, his voice echoing off the airport terminal building. "How dare any of you assume that someone's worth is determined by their clothes or their accent or whether they've flown before?" The businessman who had started my nightmare pushed forward from the crowd. "Sir, you don't understand. This woman was disruptive during the flight. She doesn't understand proper airline etiquette. We paid good money for our tickets, and we shouldn't have to deal with people who clearly don't belong in—" "Don't belong?" Alexander's voice rose, and I could see veins standing out on his neck. "Don't belong? Do you have any idea who you're talking about?" He turned to his assistant, a professional-looking woman with a tablet. "Call the mayor. Call the governor. I want every news station in the city here in 20 minutes. Then he looked back at the crowd that had gathered to watch the spectacle. "My name is Alexander Montgomery," he announced, his voice carrying with the confidence of someone accustomed to being heard. "I own Montgomery Industries, which includes Montgomery Airlines, the airline you just flew on. I also own this airport, the hotel most of you are probably staying at, and about 60% of the commercial real estate in this city." The color drained from every face in the crowd. The businessman who had been so vocal about my unworthiness looked like he was about to be sick. The airline manager and airport security guards were backing away slowly, clearly hoping to disappear into the crowd. But Alexander wasn't done. "I was on that flight today," he continued, traveling incognito to observe exactly this kind of behavior. "I wanted to see how my employees and my customers treat people they perceive as different or less fortunate, and what I witnessed was the most disgusting display of classism and cruelty I have ever seen." He gestured toward me, his voice becoming gentler. "This woman, Christine, is one of the most courageous, dignified people I have ever encountered. She endured your mockery and your contempt with more grace than any of you deserve. She is flying to this city to pursue a business opportunity that could change her life, and instead of supporting a fellow human being's dreams, you decided to crush her spirit for your own entertainment." The silence was deafening. I could see people in the crowd beginning to recognize what this meant for them. Alexander turned to the airline manager first. "You're fired. Security, escort her from the property immediately." Then to Mr. Roberts, "You're fired. Your badge, your access cards, everything. Now." He addressed the businessman who had started everything. "Mr. Johnson, yes, I know exactly who you are. Your company's contract with Montgomery Airlines is terminated immediately. You and your colleagues are permanently banned from all Montgomery properties." One by one, he addressed each person who had participated in my humiliation. Flight attendants were fired on the spot. Passengers were banned from the airline. The ripple effects were immediate and devastating for everyone who had decided that mocking a simple farm girl was acceptable entertainment. But then Alexander did something that shocked me even more than everything else that had happened. He turned back to me, took both of my hands in his, and in front of this crowd of dozens of people, he said, "Christine, I fell in love with you today. Not with your clothes or your sophistication or your status. I fell in love with your kindness, your dignity, your courage in the face of cruelty. I fell in love with the way you never lost your grace even when they tried to strip away your dignity. I've been around wealthy, powerful people my entire life, and I've never met anyone with a heart as pure as yours." I couldn't breathe. This man, this impossibly handsome, incredibly powerful man, was telling me he loved me, in front of all these people, after everything that had happened. "I don't understand," I whispered. He smiled, and it was like the sun breaking through storm clouds. "I've been searching my whole life for someone real, someone genuine, someone who knows what it means to work hard and dream big and treat people with kindness, even when they don't deserve it. I found all of that in you today." And then, right there on the curb outside the airport, in front of all the people who had spent the day making me feel worthless, Alexander Montgomery kissed me. It was soft and gentle and filled with a promise of everything I had never dared to dream possible. When we broke apart, he whispered in my ear, "Your business meeting is tomorrow, right? What if I told you that Metropolitan Foods is one of my companies, and that meeting was my way of getting to spend time with you after I heard about your farm through my agricultural contacts?" I stared at him in shock. "You... what?" He laughed, a sound full of joy and mischief. "I heard about this amazing young woman who was single-handedly running an organic farm and dreaming of expanding her operation. I wanted to meet you, but I was afraid that if you knew who I was, you'd think I was just another rich guy trying to impress you with his money. So I created a reason for you to come to the city, and I planned to accidentally meet you. I never imagined it would happen like this. 6 months later, I became Mrs. Christine Montgomery. But before you think this is just a story about a rich man rescuing a poor woman, let me tell you what really happened. Alexander didn't change me. He saw who I already was and loved me for it. He didn't try to turn me into someone sophisticated or worldly. Instead, he moved to my farm. He said that after spending his whole life in boardrooms and penthouses, he'd finally found something real in the soil and the simplicity of farm life. We expanded the farm together, but we also started something bigger. The Montgomery Agricultural Foundation now provides microloans and support to small farmers across the country. We help people like I used to be. People with big dreams and strong backs, but not enough capital to make their visions reality. As for the people who mocked me that day at the airport, some of them apologized when they realized who I'd married. I forgave them, because holding on to anger would have poisoned the beautiful life Alexander and I were building together. But I never forgot the lesson of that day, that how we treat people when we think no one important is watching reveals our true character. The businessman who started it all, Mr. Johnson, actually became one of our biggest advocates after his own business failed following the loss of his Montgomery contracts. He now volunteers at our foundation, helping other entrepreneurs avoid the mistakes he made. Today, when I look back on that terrible, wonderful day, I'm grateful for every moment of it. Not because I enjoy remembering the pain, but because it led me to the love of my life and showed me that sometimes our worst moments are actually doorways to our greatest blessings. They say fairy tales aren't real, but I'm living proof that sometimes, when you're sitting on a curb feeling like the world has forgotten you exist, a prince really can pull up in a limousine and change everything. But the real magic wasn't in Alexander's money or power. It was in the way he saw past everything superficial and fell in love with my heart. And the way I learned that I was worthy of that love, just as I was, dirt under my fingernails and all. That's my story. The story of how the worst day of my life became the first day of my real life. And every morning when I wake up next to my husband on our farm, with the sunrise painting the fields golden and the promise of a new day ahead of us, I'm reminded that sometimes the most beautiful love stories begin with the most broken hearts. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs to remember that their worth isn't determined by what they wear or where they come from, but by the kindness in their heart and the dreams they're brave enough to chase. Love can find us in the most unexpected places, often when we least expect it, but most need it.